I attended the 31st British-Irish Council Summit in the Isle of Man on the 9th of November. It was hosted by Chief Minister Howard Quayle, and I was accompanied by the Minister for Natural Resources, Community Affairs and Digital Development, Sean Canny TD. The discussion at the summit covered political developments for administrations since the last summit in June, including on the implications of Brexit, particularly for the relationship across these islands and all 7 jurisdictions. The Council also discussed the current political situation in Northern Ireland, and I restated my regret that Northern Ireland was not represented at the meeting. And in fact, everyone expressed the regret that the Deputy First Minister and First Minister weren't present because they don't exist. And that was very much a strong view around the table. The Council also endorsed plans for a future programme of work for the Council's digital inclusion work sector. Minister Canny took part in a thematic discussion on the subject of digital inclusion, and topics covered included digital rights, digital skills and literacy in partnership working between the BIC administrations. David Lidington MP, the Cabinet Office Minister, and Karen Bradley MP, Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, attended the summit meeting on behalf of the UK Government, along with the Prime Minister of Scotland, the First Minister of Scotland, the First Minister of Wales, and the Chief Ministers of Guernsey and Jersey. I took the opportunity to have a bilateral meeting with First Minister Carwyn Jones and also First Minister Nicola Sturgeon. And in both meetings we exchanged views on issues of mutual interest and continued cooperation with discussions focusing mainly on Brexit and its impacts on businesses and citizens, and also on developments in Westminster and Brussels. I wished the First Minister of Wales, First Minister Carwyn Jones, very well in his future, because it was the occasion of his last BIC summit, because he will step down as leader of the Welsh Labour Party and therefore First Minister on the 11th of December. I also held discussions with David Lidington on Brexit and on the absence of an agreement between the parties in Northern Ireland. And I underlined the importance of the restoration of the institutions in the context of the full implementation of the Good Friday Agreement, and undertook to continue to work with the British Government to assist the Northern parties to achieve this outcome.
Full restoration of the institutions in line with the full implementation of the Good Friday Agreement. That may be rhetorically your position, but that's not politically your position. Taoiseach, and week on week you amplify that reality when you take to your feet here. But I'm not going to waste the time that I have on that tit-for-tat politics. I do want to ask you this, though, because Brexit has thrown up a whole myriad of legislative and logistical issues, and future EU representation in the European Parliament for citizens in the North, whom you care deeply about, is just one of them. We, as you know, and others have pressed to ensure that citizens in the North are afforded a means of maintaining representation in the Parliament, whether that's through the allocation of seats to the North, the 2 additional seats that were afforded to this state, or indeed by extension of the franchise. I see a report in the Irish Times yesterday which says that an internal government note has been prepared on this matter, and it would appear that these suggestions have been dismissed. And if that's true, Taoiseach, I think that's very, very regrettable. In fact, it doesn't chime at all with your pledge that no one in the North would ever again left behind. So can I ask you, is there such a note? Does it dismiss these propositions? Has it been accepted by government, and will you publish it?
I think the cause of the meeting last month was unfortunately a reminder of just how bad things are in relation to the operations of the agreed structures of the 1998 Good Friday Agreement. Yet again, there was no democratic voice for Northern Ireland at the meeting. The continued suspension of the Assembly and Executive caused, we were then told by Sinn Féin's concerns about the operations of a heating scheme, means that the people of Northern Ireland have no voice at these or any other discussions about the future of relations on these islands. The bottom line is, when a scandal happens, it should never bring down the edifice of government or the edifice of Parliament. It's kind of incomprehensible when you look at it in that context. You deal with a scandal, but you don't bring down the whole operation. More importantly, Taoiseach, there is no evidence from the communiqué or any of the press conferences that there was a substantive discussion about how to approach the need for much more active and constructive relations. And I take on board what you've just said. But we proposed over 2 years ago, after Brexit was the result, that there's a need to replace the current constant East-West contact which happens between the UK and Irish governments in European Union forums with something which stops the inevitable drift which will happen if we rely on current approaches. The common travel area and mutual recognition of rights in various areas cannot function without constant interactions between the two governments. Clearly, the British-Irish Council, as it currently works, I don't think is the answer, Taoiseach. Something far more dynamic and focused on urgent issues is required. At the time, I proposed something like the Nordic Council, for example, which is very interesting, has a permanent secretariat, and works in that region in terms of countries who are members of the EU and those that are not. But there's no doubt that there will be an issue in terms of British-Irish relations post-Brexit, in terms of the familiar and frequent contacts that we've developed over the last 40 years through going to various meetings in Brussels, and that has helped enormously in an informal way relations between Ireland and the United Kingdom, and I don't think we should understate that. And I believe, given the urgency of this issue, that we do need to work substantively on that idea of what do we replace the frequency and level and quality of contacts that we've enjoyed with British ministers and officials in the context of the European Union. What do we replace that with? And is the existing British-Irish Council the correct forum? Is it substantive enough to meet that requirement? I did get an indication from the Taoiseach and yourself that you were coming around to this view, and I would be interested in hearing your perspective on it.
Well, question 2. It's not surprising that the main topic of conversation and the main focus of the discussion was on Brexit. Ever since June of 2016, the British Parliament has been deadlocked on the question of Brexit. For 2.5 years now of wrangling, we still have no solution that will, we believe, command a majority in Westminster. There is a growing likelihood, despite the wishes of many in most of this House, that the deal negotiated won't command a majority next week. There's apparently certainly no majority for a no-deal scenario. And the only thing that the British Parliament seems to agree on is the need for more information before they make up their minds. Now, obviously, this is an internal matter for the British Parliament. But there is a real risk that the UK Parliament will be unable to agree on anything before March of 2019. And that could mean a disorderly exit by the UK from the EU, by accident maybe, rather than by design. We've all agreed, and we've discussed it at some length here, that would be disastrous for Ireland. I agree we can't interfere in any way with the British decision-making process. It probably would be counterproductive to do that. But can I ask the Taoiseach, if it becomes apparent that for a rational decision to be arrived at, that more time is needed, what is your attitude? Because we now have the decision yesterday of the Advocate General of the European Court of Justice that the UK can, of its own volition, withdraw the Article 50 application. We're less clear on the postponement of the Article 50 process. If there was a view from the House of Commons, if that was their view that they needed more time, would the Irish government support a postponement of the implementation of Article 50? And what, in your view, is the attitude, or would be the attitude, of the other 26 members to that proposal?
Taoiseach, one of the more frustrating aspects of the sort of endless finger-pointing and debate about Brexit is that issues that really impact on a day-to-day level on people, particularly vulnerable and less well-off people in the north, get completely forgotten about. But one of the most obnoxious pieces of legislation that came from Westminster, but was actually passed by Stormont, with support from both Sinn Féin and the DUP, was the Welfare Reform Act. A really horrific piece of austerity, which the impact is now being felt by some of the most vulnerable people in the north. And this would, of course, this austerity legislation would also affect all of Britain. The PIP assessment, Personal Independence Payment Assessment, truly obnoxious, where people, in order to renew their payments, are having to fill out forms where they're asked questions like, are you incontinent? Can you wash yourself? And if you try and, if you're embarrassed by those questions and would rather not answer them, you can have your payment cut off. I don't know if anybody ever saw Ken Loach's film I, Daniel Blake, but this is the incarnation of this stuff. Was passed by Stormont but is being implemented now. Recently, for example, somebody with stage 4 cancer was cut off their PIP payment. Someone else who was shot in the head at the age of 15 and has been suffering from depression ever since was denied their payment. And similarly with the universal credit, another one of these so-called welfare reforms, incredibly, you only get welfare payments for up to 2 children, unless, if you've more than 2 children, unless the 3rd or the 4th child is a product of rape. Incredible, right? It's absolutely incredible stuff is being imposed in the north. So I just wonder, Taoiseach, do these matters get discussed at the council? Right. Because these are really impacting on some of the most vulnerable people in the most obnoxious way in the north.
Deputy Eamon Ryan.
Taoiseach, I presume we've all been following the developments in the House of Commons in recent days, the publication of the legal advice today, and the sense of bewilderment in the sense that it seems that they've taken upon the backstop issue to be the focus of all their attention. It seems to me it's used in so many ways as a proxy for the internal real war that's going on between those who want a hard Brexit and a soft Brexit. In that regard, I'm just interested at the council meeting where you would have had that opportunity for informal discussions of the leader of the Labour Party in Wales, who I presume could easily use that opportunity to articulate concerns that the Labour Party might have, or indeed Minister Lillington. In those circumstances, were people, or do they raising those fundamental concerns about the backstop? And if so, what do they say? What is the argument that we have to counter or challenge? From our perspective, it's clearly just embodying protections of what the Good Friday Agreement delivered. I'd be interested to know whether it was raised at the British Irish Council, and if so, by either the Labour Party or the Conservatives. What is their real concern?
I just want to contribute briefly in relation to the mention of PIP and to point out in terms of North-South relations that notwithstanding Ken Loach's film, which I've seen because I admire Ken Loach and I've seen his films over the years, that situation would never arise in Ireland because if you remember, the worker in the film is a worker who's worked all his life, his wife died having had a terminal illness, and he became a widower. In our system, as every deputy in the House knows, he would entirely qualify on a paid basis for a widower's full pension, which of course in the Republic is much more substantial than it is in the North or in the UK. So I'd just be concerned that people would become frightened of the examples that have been given and suggest that our system and the people who work in social protection in Ireland actually handle them in the same way as has been happened in the UK. One thing, by the way, that should be discussed is in the UK a lot of this is outsourced, whereas very little of ours is outsourced. And in fairness, Ken Loach's film is striking about the UK, but the system is totally different in Ireland, just to reassure you, Deputy, in case you're advising
Yeah, just over.
Thanks. I want to thank the deputies again for their questions. Deputy McDonald asked about representation for Northern Ireland in the European Parliament after Brexit. The sad reality, and it is a sad reality, is that after Brexit, Northern Ireland will no longer be part of the European Union. We hope it is the case should the should the withdrawal agreement be ratified, that important elements of EU law and EU regulations will still apply in Northern Ireland, but that won't change the fact that the United Kingdom is going to leave the European Union as a whole, and Northern Ireland, albeit against the will of the majority of people in Northern Ireland, is being taken out of the European Union and will leave with the rest of the United Kingdom. And there is no non-EU country and no non-EU territory that has representation in the European Parliament. Provision is made for accession countries, countries that are joining to have observers, but it's not the case that there's any non-EU country or non-EU territory that's represented in the European Parliament. An issue, of course, could arise whereby perhaps similar to accession countries, Northern Ireland could have observers in the European Parliament, perhaps contributing to the debate, particularly when it comes to rules and regulations that may apply to Northern Ireland. But again, one of the difficulties we have is that's not something that we can impose on Northern Ireland from here. It has to be something that a Northern Ireland Executive or a Northern Ireland Assembly would seek. And you know, we're doing our best on all occasions to preserve the rights of EU citizens who will be living in Northern Ireland after Brexit, and to maximise the freedoms and benefits they continue to receive. But we are slightly weakened by the fact that it's the government here in Dublin that's asking for those things, and not a Northern Ireland Assembly or a Northern Ireland Executive. And in many cases, Northern Ireland elected reps are saying they don't want them, and that has definitely weakened our position. I do think it's important, though, to make a distinction between citizens' rights and rights that are linked to residency. What we have ensured is that Irish citizens living in Northern Ireland will continue to be EU citizens and will have all the rights that come with EU citizenship. And that is the right, for example, to travel freely, work, study, access education in any part of the European Union. So somebody who lives in Northern Ireland, lives in Belfast or Derry, is an Irish citizen, will be able to work in Berlin, will be able to study in Athens, will be able to travel freely to Spain, when a British citizen living in Belfast might not be able to do those things, might need a work visa or work permit or some other sort of permission to do those things. So all those rights that are attached to citizenship, Irish citizens, by virtue of being EU citizens in Northern Ireland, will continue to have those things. There are, however, some rights that are linked to residency. And the same way that an Irish citizen living in Canada doesn't have the same rights as an Irish citizen living in Ireland, those that are linked to residency will be more difficult to secure. But we do want to secure them, and in particular the ones that we're seeking to secure, we've had some positive discussions on this, is the ability of Irish citizens in Northern Ireland to continue to participate in programmes like Erasmus, for Irish citizens in Northern Ireland to continue to benefit from the European Health Insurance Card. And we're getting a good hearing on those things in the European Union. But again, it would be we'd a much better chance of achieving these things if there was a Deputy First Minister and a First Minister from Northern Ireland also looking for these things. It would put us in a much stronger position.
In the next batch.